Gert Opperman. He's spent 10 years, he tells us, as a coal supply unit manager. Pretty technical, the testimony he's giving there, but what's the crux of it?
Yes, Michelle, we're getting into the finer details of coal contracts between Tegeta and Eskom, and in fact, Optimum under Glencore ownership before Tegeta took over. The crux of it really is what are grounds for penalties over coal supply to Eskom. And we've heard about two different kinds of penalties that can be imposed. One, for abrasion indexes. So when coal is abrasive, it can have an effect on the power plants that Eskom then uses that coal in. It can damage surfaces, and Eskom then incurs a maintenance cost on various equipment. So that's the one, the abrasive index. The other one is sizing. If the coal sizing changes, that too can have an impact and is cause for penalties Eskom then imposes on its suppliers. And the reason that this is important, Michelle, is because Glencore was subject to a penalty, depending on your estimations, and this was disputed, of about 2 billion rand at the time that it sold Optimum and was undergoing business rescue to Tegeta. And the question is whether or not the penalties that were imposed on Glencore's Optimum were fair or not, whether the calculations were just or whether it was being manipulated in order to try and pressurize Glencore into relinquishing Optimum and handing it over to Tegeta for about 2 million rand.
Aaron, he's talked about coal quality issues, and this is a subject that we've heard about repeatedly from Eskom itself when it's talked about maintenance issues at the power stations, perhaps things that might have led to the load shedding that we've experienced over the past years. Opperman himself says coal quality would have been his responsibility. He actually admitted that when questioned by Advocate Vincent Maleka. It's going to be interesting to see perhaps how that admission unfolds as his testimony continues.
Yes, I mean, he conceded it without any sort of, secrecy or anything of the kind. Maleka went through Opperman's various responsibilities in the primary energy division at Eskom and his involvement in various power stations, coal supply to Hendrina, for example, to Arnott and to Komati, amongst others. And yes, this issue of the quality of the coal is certainly a crux issue over Optimum itself, both under Glencore and Tegeta. And what we heard from Opperman this morning is that there were issues around the sizing and the abrasion indexes of coal supplies from Optimum under Glencore control back to 2011, 2013. And so Eskom and Glencore were negotiating at some point successfully, at some points things seem to have broken down somewhat, to try and amend the contracts to minimize the penalties that Glencore would then have to pay, because it seemed as though the quality of coal was consistently poorer than it had been before. And here's where it gets really interesting. I can't profess to be an expert on coal supply to the parastatal, and I'd be wary of going into the details of how the quality of coal affects the actual output of energy, something you touched on there, Michelle. But what is important is to understand how the coal gets to the power plant. So you have a coal mine, like Optimum, for example, then there are these conveyor belts. In one instance, Optimum described a conveyor belt of 35 kilometers. The coal gets put on that conveyor belt and it rattles along to the power plant. But in this case, the conveyor belt had 18 different stops, so drop-off points, where the coal would then become slightly damaged and the sizing would change because of its movements. And that was one of the grounds on his testimony for penalties incurred by Optimum under Glencore and then deducted from Eskom's bill, which it would pay to Glencore for the coal from Optimum.
Sure, yeah, I think we're getting some insight into Eskom and how it operates a lot more than any of us imagined. Thanks very much for that. Aaron Bates is tracking the state capture inquiry.